When I returned from prison, no one met me at the station. Even the neighbor's dog, who used to bark with joy, stayed silent. I just wanted to buy a loaf of bread. But every time I stepped into a store, the cashier would fall silent, and people would begin whispering behind my back. Sometimes they even walked away. On paper, I was given a second chance, but not in their eyes. And if prison had walls, then outside those walls began another cage, thinner, colder, and far harder to escape. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Loretta Harding. I was 63 years old when I stepped off the Greyhound bus and onto the cracked sidewalk of Dillon, Montana. A bag in one hand, a second-hand coat too large for my shoulders, and no one waiting for me. The sky stretched gray and indifferent above the mountains, and the wind smelled of pine needles and old dust. I had been gone 19 years, long enough for everyone to move on, long enough to become a ghost. Dylan hadn't changed much, not in the ways that mattered. The old bank still stood at the corner with its shuttered windows and peeling paint. The laundromat buzzed under flickering fluorescent lights, and the grocery store with its broken E in the neon sign still hummed in the same mechanical rhythm. But the people had aged, shifted like books left too long on the shelf. Familiar faces carried unfamiliar weight. Names I remembered were etched into faces I barely recognized. I didn't expect banners or hugs. I didn't expect smiles. But I thought maybe, just maybe, the town would have softened at the edges. It hadn't. I wasn't back home. I was back in the crime scene. They still called me the woman who killed her husband, even though the court had finally reduced the sentence, finally accepted the truth. It was self-defense. But justice in the courtroom doesn't reach into coffee shops, doesn't echo in school parking lots or church pews. Here, guilt was a shadow that never left your heel. I walked the streets slowly, like testing the ground after an earthquake. The uneven pavement pressed into the soles of my shoes. I passed the church where I used to sing alto in the choir, the one with the white steeple and blue door. I didn't look up. I kept my eyes forward. My breath was steady, but my heart wasn't. It knocked against my ribs like a warning bell. I had nowhere to be. My aunt, who used to live in a weathered trailer at the edge of town, had died 5 years ago. The trailer sat abandoned since, left to chip and sag like forgotten bread. But it was mine now, legally. That's what the papers said. I didn't know if I belonged there either, but it had a roof, and that was more than some had after release. The town had grown quieter, or maybe I had grown louder inside. Every sound, the crunch of gravel under tires, the distant bark of a dog, the slam of a porch door, felt amplified. Not because they were louder, but because I was raw. I hadn't heard unfiltered life in nearly 2 decades. In prison, everything had a rhythm. The doors clanked open and closed on schedule. The buzzers rang. The footsteps echoed the same way every morning. But here, everything moved without permission. It moved without me. I crossed the main intersection and turned onto Blue Jay Lane, the street where I had once lived with Nathaniel. He was buried in the next county, no headstone, just coordinates on a map. I passed our old house. Someone else had painted it mint green. The front yard was neater than I remembered. No children's toys, no flower beds, just trimmed grass and a swing hanging from the porch. It didn't creak. Maybe the wind respected new owners more than it ever respected us. I walked past the library. It was closed for the day. A hand-painted sign in the window said so. But I saw someone inside. A woman shelved books without looking up. I lingered just long enough to catch her eyes by accident. She froze. Her lips parted slightly, like she'd seen something unnatural. Then she turned her back. I walked on. I had tried not to imagine this return too often while inside. It was easier to think in general terms: freedom, fresh air, coffee that didn't taste like ash. But the specifics had always been blurred. Now they were sharp. Now every mailbox was a reminder, every dog a past memory. The grocery store at the end of the block used to sell the best honey bread. I remembered the smell, sweet and yeasty, clinging to your hands like a soft promise. I hadn't tasted it in 19 years. I didn't go inside. Instead, I walked around the back streets, past the middle school with its rusted goal posts, past the clinic with the chipped awning, until I reached the field where teenagers used to drag stolen mattresses to stargaze. The grass was taller now, wild and unkept. I stood there and let the wind push against me. I closed my eyes and listened. And for a moment, I wasn't Loretta Harding, former inmate 0293601. I was just a woman standing in a field, older, tired, and trying to breathe through years of cement. I reached the trailer just after sunset. The air had cooled. Crickets chirped from the ditch, and the wooden steps groaned under my weight. The key stuck in the lock. I jiggled it, and the door gave way with a sigh. Inside, the smell of mildew and mouse droppings curled in my nose. The carpet was matted, the sink stained, the air stale. I didn't bother turning on the overhead light. Instead, I found the small table lamp in the corner, plugged it in, and sat down at the metal kitchen chair. I laid my bag on the counter, took out a tin of instant coffee, a packet of crackers, a folded sheet of paper that had my name written in loopy cursive, my aunt's will. Everything felt weightless and heavy at the same time. The silence inside the trailer pressed on my skin like a wet cloth. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. It didn't ask where I had been. It didn't care what I had done. It just moved, brushing against the windows, rattling the screen door. I sat in that silence for hours, holding a chipped mug of lukewarm water and staring at the dark space between the fridge and the stove. That space seemed as good a place as any to disappear. In prison, I had a bed, a routine, and a number. Here, I had none of those things. Only a memory that stuck to me like soot. Only the sharp knowledge that I was no longer behind bars, but still very much confined. I wanted to sleep, but my body resisted. It didn't trust comfort. I lay on the old cot without undressing. The springs creaked, and something beneath the mattress poked into my hip. But I stayed still. My eyes wandered the ceiling, following the patterns of water stains and cobwebs. I was back in Dillon, the place of my birth, the place of my sentence, the place of my shadow. And I knew now, coming back wasn't a return. It was an entrance into another kind of exile, one without walls, one where everyone was the warden, and no one handed you your time. The morning crept in without ceremony. Pale light seeped through the small square window above the sink, illuminating the stale air with a colorless gray. It was not a sunrise that greeted me. It was a quiet nudge, a reluctant signal that time continued even if I had no intention of following it. I lay still for several minutes, staring at the ceiling, where moisture stains had formed the shape of old maps, continents of mildew drifting in unknown seas. My back ached from the cot's uneven springs, and my hips throbbed from sleeping in the same position all night. There was no comfort in that trailer, no softness to ease into, only flat surfaces, cold edges, and the sense that every object had been waiting in silence for someone to disturb it. I hadn't dreamed, or if I had, the dreams left no trace. My sleep had been a long blink, an interruption of thought rather than rest. I sat up slowly. My body was no longer used to mornings without noise. In prison, the first sounds came early: metal doors, heavy boots, someone yelling a name. Here, there was only the hum of silence. No schedule, No clanging signal, just a slow return to myself. I rinsed my face with water that stank faintly of iron. The faucet sputtered as though insulted by my touch. I stared at my reflection in the small bathroom mirror, foggy, scratched, too dim to show much. What I could see was a face drained of color, a neck thinner than I remembered, and eyes that no longer reflected anything back. I didn't look old exactly. I looked like a photograph left out in the rain. I dressed without hurry. Clothes didn't carry the same weight they once did. The jeans sagged on my waist. The sweater I'd bought at a secondhand shop before the bus ride hung loose on my shoulders. I tied my shoes, bent slowly, my knees protesting the motion. I had no jewelry, no makeup, no perfume, just a wallet with an ID that made people flinch and $27 in cash. It took longer than it should have to open the front door. The lock was stubborn, the handle sticky with age. When it finally gave way, the door groaned like a waking animal. I stood on the threshold for a long moment. Outside, the morning had become a thin veil of blue and wind. The ground sparkled with last night's frost. I could smell chimney smoke from a nearby house. It reminded me of winters from childhood, when I used to walk to school with numb fingers and a lunchbox swinging from my wrist. I stepped out. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no sudden gust of wind, no shift in the air. But my heart paused for the briefest second. Because I had crossed a line. In prison, thresholds didn't mean anything. Every door was watched, every step counted. But here, on that small porch with its sagging floorboards and one cracked tile, I had chosen to leave. I had chosen to walk into the world again, a world that hadn't asked me to return. I followed the dirt path toward the street, where the gravel met the pavement. My shoes kicked up cold dust with each step. The houses I passed looked like they belonged to a faded postcard. Chipped shutters, faded paint, rusted lawn chairs. Some porches held pumpkins from last October, their skins now collapsed and soft. Others were decorated with flags or wind chimes, as if hoping noise might ward off time. No one was outside. Dillon in the morning was a town that whispered. Curtains shifted behind windows. A dog barked once and then quieted. Somewhere, a screen door slammed and echoed for blocks. I walked with my head low, not out of shame, but out of caution. A face like mine carried memory, and I had no armor against it. The first store I reached was a small convenience shop, wedged between a gas station and a boarded-up cafe. I paused before entering, my hand resting on the glass door. A sticker near the handle said, "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone." I stared at it for a long time. My fingers trembled slightly, and not from the cold. Finally, I pushed the door open. The bell above rang with a sound that felt too cheerful, too bright. Inside, the smell of coffee, old magazines, and freezer burn clung to the air. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. A man behind the counter looked up. He was in his 60s, with sun-damaged skin and a cap that said NRA. His eyes paused on me longer than necessary. Not recognition, but something worse. Curiosity mixed with the desire not to ask. I wandered the narrow aisles slowly. Chips, canned soup, cat food, toothpaste. Nothing urgent, but I picked up a small loaf of bread, a tin of tuna, and a bar of soap. My hands trembled slightly as I carried them. I tried to pretend this was a normal errand. Just groceries, just errands. But I could feel the weight of every item in my arms like a verdict. When I approached the counter, the man didn't speak. He scanned the items with the slow disinterest of someone used to silence. I handed him a crumpled $10 bill. He gave me change without touching my hand. I nodded my thanks and turned to leave. He didn't stop me, didn't wish me a good day, but I felt his eyes on my back until the door closed behind me. Outside, the wind had picked up. I tightened my coat and clutched the bag closer. Across the street, a woman pushing a stroller slowed her pace. Her eyes met mine, then darted away. She crossed to the other side of the road. It was subtle, polite even. But it wasn't the wind that made me cold in that moment. It was the look in her eyes. Not fear, not hate, just distance, as if I were something behind glass. I took the long way home, past the post office, where an old man in a red vest leaned against the wall, smoking. He squinted at me and said nothing. Past the school, where a group of children spilled out for recess, their laughter sharp and chaotic. I watched from across the field, hidden behind a row of trees. For a second, I let myself imagine what it would feel like to belong again, but the image crumbled before it could settle. When I returned to the trailer, my hands were stiff and my feet numb. I dropped the groceries onto the counter and sat down heavily. The air inside hadn't warmed. I stared at the loaf of bread for a long time. It looked like any other loaf, the kind anyone might buy. But in my hands, it felt symbolic, like I had purchased permission to exist, even for a moment. I made a sandwich. It tasted like nothing, but I chewed slowly, as if each bite carved a little more space into this town that no longer wanted me. Later, I sat by the window, watching the light fade. No one came, no one knocked, no one shouted. And in that absence, I found a strange kind of rhythm, a ritual I hadn't known I needed. A first step had been taken, and while no one welcomed me back, the door hadn't closed behind me. Not yet. The world didn't have to open. I just needed it not to slam shut. The days folded into one another like worn pages in an old book, creased and yellowed, the edges fraying from too much memory. Dillon was not a large town, but it had many eyes. Some stared openly, others lingered on the periphery, behind drawn curtains or shaded porch swings. Their presence was not always visible, but it pressed on me like weather, constant, shifting, impossible to ignore. It was not always hatred. That would have been easier. Hatred had shape, weight, noise. Hatred demanded confrontation. But what I faced most often was something softer, stranger. Recognition blended with something that looked like pity, or worse, amusement. A kind of voyeurism that kept people silent but watchful, like spectators at a long, slow parade they hadn't paid to see. I noticed it first at the laundromat. I hadn't wanted to go, but the small washer in the trailer groaned itself to death after one load, and the smell of damp clothes began to fill the air like mildew memories. The laundromat was on 5th Street, next to the old barber shop that hadn't changed since I was a teenager. I remembered sitting there once, waiting for my father, watching the spinning candy-striped pole, thinking it looked like a signal for something important. The laundromat door creaked as I entered. The machines were humming, their rhythms overlapping into a dull mechanical hymn. A woman near the far wall glanced up. Her eyes widened just slightly, then narrowed. She didn't say anything, but I saw the flicker. Not fear. Something older, more conditioned. Her hand paused in mid-fold, clutching a faded t-shirt. Then she turned away, slowly, deliberately, and continued folding with exaggerated calm. I chose a washer in the corner, as far from her as possible, even though the machines all functioned the same. I moved slowly, not out of tiredness, but to show I meant no harm, as if my pace might undo the tension coiled around the room. As I poured detergent into the open hatch, I could feel her gaze return, not directly, but through glances cast in the chrome of the dryer door. When I turned to sit, she had already gathered her basket and left. Her steps were fast, her keys jangling like a warning. The door shut behind her with a thud that echoed longer than it should have. I sat in the silence, listening to the washer churn. A strip of sunlight stretched across the linoleum floor, catching lint and a few forgotten coins. I stared at that light and wondered when I had become someone people fled from. The supermarket was next. I needed milk and rice, nothing more. I told myself I'd be quick. I knew the layout well enough to be in and out in 5 minutes. The store hadn't changed since the late 90s. The same sickly yellow tiles, the same buzzing lights, the same hum of refrigerators in the back aisle. What had changed were the people, or rather, their eyes. A man in a flannel shirt passed me near the produce section. He glanced up, did a double take, then smiled in a way that didn't reach his cheeks. I didn't remember his name, but his face stirred something faint. Baseball games, maybe, or high school picnics. He didn't stop. He didn't speak. But as he walked away, I saw his head tilt toward a woman nearby, and her eyes snapped to me with surgical precision. Whispers moved faster than footsteps. By the time I reached the checkout line, I could feel the pull of glances from every direction, short, sharp darts of awareness. I lowered my head, placed the groceries on the belt, and fumbled for my wallet. The cashier was young, maybe 19, with pale skin and hair tied back in a tight bun. Her lips parted as she read my name on the ID. I saw her throat shift as she swallowed. She said nothing, just scanned the items with mechanical urgency. The total blinked on the screen. I handed her the cash. Our fingers touched for half a second, and she recoiled slightly, the way someone might touch something unexpectedly warm. She smiled after, too quickly, like an apology her body couldn't follow. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, casting hard shadows against the pavement. I stood there with my bag, unsure if I had forgotten something or simply didn't want to go home yet. Cars passed. No one honked. No one waved. But I felt the town watching me again, through windows, through windshields, through the stillness itself. Later, I walked through the park. The benches were mostly empty, except for one older couple feeding ducks near the pond. The woman noticed me first. Her hand stilled mid-crumb, and she leaned toward her husband. He looked up, nodded once, and they both stood without hurry. But they didn't finish feeding the ducks. They just left. The path wound past the playground. A group of mothers sat on a bench, chatting, laughing. Their children screamed with joy, climbing over the jungle gym like vines. As I neared, one of the mothers caught sight of me. She nudged the woman beside her. Whispers again. Not loud, not cruel, but enough. One by one, they called to their children, voices tightening with forced cheer. The children didn't want to leave, but they obeyed, drawn away like leaves in wind. I sat on the empty bench they had vacated. It was warm from their presence. A juice box lay abandoned in the grass. I picked it up, tossed it in the trash. Then I watched the empty swing sway back and forth in the breeze, creaking softly, as if echoing a child's laughter that had already disappeared. Back at home, I stood in front of the mirror and stared into my own eyes, not to admire them, not even to understand them. I was looking for something, a mark, a symbol, a stain that others saw, but I could not. There was nothing unusual there, just eyes. Tired, yes, weathered, but not monstrous, not cruel. Yet everywhere I went, people looked at me as though they saw more, as though my pupils held images they couldn't unsee. Maybe that was the weight I carried now, not my past, but their memory of it. It lived in them like a ghost, and every time I entered a room, I dragged that ghost behind me like a shadow stitched into my spine. I sat down with a notebook, one I'd brought home from the dollar store. Its cover was soft, almost cloth-like. I opened to the first page and began to write. Not a confession, not a justification, just a list. A list of the places I had gone, the people I had seen, the expressions I remembered. I needed to map the new terrain of this town, not with streets, but with glances, with moments, with the traces left in people's eyes. Each entry was small, a glance, a flinch, a silence, but together they formed a story. One I hadn't written, one that had been etched into the town during my absence, carved by headlines and rumors, hardened by time and repetition. It was their version of me, and it had taken root. That night I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, notebook in hand, and listened to the silence breathe. A moth tapped against the glass, over and over, tracing its own story in dust. I watched it until it fell away, and I thought, maybe that's what I had become to them. A flutter in the corner of vision. Unwanted, distracting, fragile, but persistent. It started like any other Thursday. The sky was a dull, worn blue, the kind of blue that looked rubbed thin by too many seasons. The air smelled like wet gravel and old leaves, as if the town had been soaked in memory overnight. I woke up early, before the world made noise, and sat on the edge of the bed staring at the wall across from me. The paint was cracked in one place, a thin fracture running like a vein down its surface. I had never noticed it before. Or maybe I had, but my mind refused to make note of things that didn't bleed or bruise. I didn't know I would disappear that day. I didn't know I would stop being visible in the way that people are used to seeing other people. But something in the silence told me I was slipping, like a thread being pulled slowly through thick fabric, leaving behind the faintest hollow. I made coffee in the chipped white pot that hissed every morning like it resented being woken up. The smell filled the trailer, bitter and burnt, comforting in the way only a ritual can be. I sipped it slowly, watching the steam rise, curling into shapes that vanished before I could name them. There was something holy in those moments, the quiet between routines, the hush before intrusion. I put on my coat and walked into town. The gravel crunched under my shoes, the sound sharp and satisfying. Every step felt like a punctuation mark in a sentence no one was reading. The trees along the path had started to lose their leaves, and they fell without drama, without performance, simply letting go because it was time. I passed by the library. The windows were fogged, the shelves behind them barely visible. I used to love that place. I remembered sitting in the far corner, away from the other kids, flipping through books about faraway cities and silent women with unbreakable spines. I had believed back then that knowledge could protect you, that if you knew enough, read enough, you could shield yourself from the cruelty of the world. But knowledge hadn't saved me. It had only made the bars more obvious once they were in place. At the post office, a woman I recognized from childhood stood at the counter. Her hair was white now, pulled back in a severe bun, and her hands shook slightly as she held an envelope. When she turned and saw me, her face stiffened. I could see her eyes struggling to match the woman I had become with the girl she remembered. I gave a slight nod, but she looked past me as if I were a ghost passing through a photograph. Her body shifted sideways, just enough to put space between us, as if guilt could be contagious and memory airborne. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. I was already vanishing in her mind, already dissolving back into the version of me they all carried, flattened, edited, scrubbed of complication. Not a woman, but a story, a warning, a headline that never aged. I walked to the store, though I didn't need anything. Sometimes I went just to feel part of something. The automatic doors opened with a sigh, like they were tired of greeting me. The fluorescent lights flickered, humming faintly overhead. I picked up a loaf of bread, not because I wanted it, but because it gave my hands a task. As I moved through the aisles, I noticed how people stood a little straighter when they saw me, how conversations paused mid-word, how laughter muted itself into throat clearing and glances. There was a moment near the canned goods when I locked eyes with a boy, maybe 16, maybe younger. He looked at me curiously, not cruelly, not yet. He didn't look away. He studied me the way you study a painting you've only heard rumors about. I wondered what he'd been told, what his parents said in low voices when they thought he was asleep, whether they used my name or just the word, murderer. I smiled at him softly, his head tilted. Then, just as suddenly, his mother appeared at the end of the aisle, grabbed his shoulder, and turned him away. Her eyes met mine for a flash of a second, something like shame flickering behind them, but she said nothing, just kept walking, the boy in tow. That was the moment I felt it. The slipping, the coming undone. Not because of anything they did, but because of what I didn't do. I didn't react. I didn't flinch or cry or frown. I felt nothing, like the air around me had thickened into something invisible but heavy. I moved through it, but it no longer responded, no longer wrapped itself around my form. I was becoming atmosphere, a name without weight, a presence without gravity. I walked out of the store and sat on the bench near the bus stop. The bench was cold, the metal digging into the backs of my thighs. Across the street, a man swept the sidewalk outside his barber shop. He didn't look up, not once. I watched him for 5 minutes, nothing, as if I didn't exist, as if I had become part of the bench, part of the cement, something fixed and irrelevant. I looked at my hands. They still looked like mine, veined, dry, knuckled, but they didn't feel like they belonged to anyone. I thought of all the things those hands had done, the violence they were accused of, the lives they had held, the papers they had signed, the walls they had touched in the dark, and still they sat there, folded quietly in my lap, unacknowledged by the world. On the walk back home, I didn't take the sidewalk. I cut through the empty lot behind the diner. The ground was uneven, the grass patchy and soft. There was an old plastic chair lying on its side, half buried in dirt, a soda can crushed beside it. I stared at the chair for a long time, then righted it and sat. No one was around. No windows faced the lot. I sat there for almost an hour, watching nothing, listening to the sound of distant tires on asphalt and the occasional caw of a crow overhead. It was the freest I had felt in years, because for that 1 hour I wasn't Amanda Hale, the ex-convict. I wasn't the woman they whispered about or looked through or remembered inaccurately. I was just a body in a chair, surrounded by weeds and wind. And in that silence, I let myself vanish, not into shame or regret, but into stillness, into something simpler than forgiveness. When I finally stood, my legs ached, and the sky had begun to bruise with late afternoon color. I didn't feel different, but I also didn't feel real. I walked home slowly, letting the wind pass through me. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and let it close behind me like a curtain drawn across a stage. That night, I turned off every light. I didn't need them. I already knew where everything was. I made tea I didn't drink. I opened a book I didn't read. I moved from one room to the next without sound. And somewhere between the kitchen and the bedroom, it happened. I disappeared. Not in the magical sense, not in body, but in presence, in meaning, in the way the world holds on to a person, names them, includes them. I became a silence that others stepped around, a memory edited for comfort, a woman unspoken. And oddly, for the first time in a long time, it didn't hurt. It felt like peace. It had been raining the whole night before, not the kind of theatrical storm with thunderclaps and streaks of lightning, but a persistent gray drizzle that crept into the bones of the town and lingered like an old shame. The morning felt swollen with dampness. Everything dripped. The trees bowed under the weight of waterlogged leaves, and even the gravel on the road seemed darker, quieter, like it had nothing left to say. I hadn't planned to get up early, but sleep had become a visitor I couldn't depend on. It arrived when it wanted, left without saying goodbye, and often forgot to come at all. I had started to measure nights not by hours, but by how many times I turned over, how many times the clock's red digits changed without me noticing. That morning, I rose before the sun. The light in the kitchen was dim and bruised, the windows fogged with condensation. I boiled water and held the cup close to my face, letting the warmth hit my skin. It was one of the few comforts I still allowed myself, a ritual without expectation. The trailer was silent. The walls held nothing but breath and memory. I had become so used to silence that the presence of another sound, even a bird's cry or a dog barking in the distance, startled me. My ears had grown sharp, attuned to the creaks of floorboards and the soft settling of things. So, when the knock came, it arrived like a fracture, clean, sudden, decisive. It wasn't loud, it wasn't hurried. Just three soft raps on the door, spaced evenly, like someone marking time. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined it, if the isolation had finally found a voice. I held my breath, listening. Then, again, three knocks. Precise, intentional. My first instinct was to stay still, to disappear into the stillness like I always did. Maybe they would leave. Maybe they were looking for someone else. Maybe it was just a delivery person or a kid on a dare. But no one knocked on this door, not anymore. Not since I returned from the place where people go to be forgotten. I stood slowly, my knees stiff from sitting too long. The mug in my hand trembled slightly, a ripple running across the surface of the tea. I set it down and walked toward the door with cautious steps, as if each plank of the floor might betray me. The air felt thick, and my skin prickled with a tension I couldn't name. I didn't open the door. I stood just behind it, silent, watching the space where the light crept under the frame. I waited. Nothing, no movement, no voice, just the echo of those three knocks reverberating in my chest. Whoever it was didn't knock again. Curiosity moved in slowly, like fog. I pressed my eye to the peephole. There was no one, just the damp morning, the road still glistening, and the low hum of the world pretending nothing had happened. But something had. The knock had unsettled something inside me. A shift, a crack, a question I didn't know how to answer. I stepped back and sat down in the chair by the window. I stayed there for a long time, watching the street. No cars passed, no figures moved, just rain dripping from the eaves and the occasional shiver of wind in the trees. The day moved slowly after that. I couldn't shake the feeling. It clung to me like a wet coat. I went through the motions, laundry, sweeping, reorganizing the pantry shelves. But my thoughts kept circling back to the sound, the knock, the shape it made in the silence. By afternoon, the rain had stopped, and the light turned pale and directionless. I walked out to the porch and sat on the steps. The air smelled of wet earth and rust. I looked at the marks on the wood near the door. Faint impressions, possibly from shoes. Not fresh, but not old either. I touched them lightly, as if they could speak. That evening, I opened the box where I kept old papers, court documents, letters never mailed, newspaper clippings with my name under bold headlines. I hadn't looked at them in months. I had tried to forget they existed, tried to pretend I was just a woman in a small town, not the woman who had been defined by a single act. But that knock had brought everything back, not just the past, but the fear that it still lived somewhere outside, wearing a new face. As the sky darkened and the light drained from the room, I lit the single lamp near the armchair. Its glow made everything feel smaller, closer. I stared at the door. I waited, though I didn't know what for. An answer, an apology, a second knock. But nothing came. And then I realized something deeper, something that shifted my understanding of the day. It wasn't that someone had knocked, it was that someone had remembered that I was here, that I existed, that I wasn't entirely erased from the map. For months, I had been moving through this place like a ghost, untouched and unnoticed. People passed me like weather. I was something to be endured, not engaged. But the knock was proof that someone had registered my presence, that I occupied space and air and thought. That realization was more terrifying than comforting, because it meant I was still vulnerable, still reachable, still seen. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the door until dawn, listening for sounds that never came. I kept replaying those three knocks in my mind, trying to assign them meaning. Were they an invitation, a warning, a mistake? I didn't know. I still don't. But from that day forward, I started locking the door differently, not out of fear of danger, but fear of memory, of being pulled back into a version of myself I had fought to bury. The knock had unearthed something I couldn't put away again. I began to walk less, speak less. I took down the chimes outside the window and stopped going to the store. I ordered groceries by phone and left the money under the mat. The delivery girl never looked at me, and I never looked at her. It was a silent arrangement, safe, clean. Weeks passed, maybe months. The knock didn't return, but the echo remained. It lived in the walls, it breathed through the floorboards, and I carried it inside me, like a secret heartbeat, reminding me that the world still had hands, still had knuckles, still had the power to knock. The town hadn't changed much, at least not in the ways that mattered. The names on the storefronts shifted like faces in a crowd, but the bones of the place remained stubborn. The same cracked sidewalks wound through streets lined with modest houses and weather-worn porches. The same church bell rang at noon, not for salvation, but out of habit. Even the wind carried the same scent of clay, grass, and forgotten things. A town doesn't have to speak to remember. It remembers in how it looks away. I could have left. There was no court order tying me to this place, no ankle monitor blinking beneath my jeans, no parole officer checking my mailbox. I was free in the legal sense of the word, but freedom was a landscape I didn't recognize anymore. It felt too wide, too empty. Out there, in the vast sprawl beyond the county line, I would have been a stranger with a story I couldn't explain. Here, at least, my sentence had texture. Familiar walls, familiar glares, familiar silence. I stayed, not because I believed in redemption or because I wanted to prove something. I stayed because there is a certain honesty in being hated for what you actually did. Out there, the hatred might come disguised. Here, it was pure, open, uncomplicated. A woman behind the counter refused to hand me change directly. A man crossed the street when he saw me coming. A child, no older than 7, whispered something to his mother and pointed at me with a kind of cartoonish fear. All of it was a language I understood. This was not a misunderstanding. This was judgment with roots. I learned to live small. I rented a room above a defunct bakery that still smelled like bread in the walls. The owner, a widower with cataracts, didn't ask questions. He liked tenants who didn't make noise and paid in cash. I became a ghost with groceries. I swept my steps twice a week and planted marigolds in a chipped ceramic pot outside my window. Their orange heads bobbed in the wind like they didn't know where they were. Time passed in shapeless increments. Not quite weeks, not quite months. I marked it in habits. Mondays were for washing sheets. Tuesdays, the market before it got crowded. Wednesdays, sweeping the stoop. Thursdays, staring too long at the ceiling. I gave myself these routines like stitches, holding myself together with patterns. The grocery store became my only real theater of exposure. I learned to shop fast, head down, list in hand, basket never full enough to invite attention. I timed my visits to avoid peak hours, but still, there were always eyes. People don't need to speak to hurt you. They do it with breath held just a second too long, with the slight turn of a shoulder, with the way their footsteps quicken when they pass. It was worse than shouting. Silence stains deeper. Once, a man I recognized from high school stood in front of me in the checkout line. His hair had thinned, and his shoulders had collapsed inward with the weight of age or regret. He didn't turn around, but I could see the way his knuckles tightened around the handle of his cart. The cashier scanned his things slowly, almost ceremonially. I could feel every beep like a tick of a clock counting down. When he left, he didn't say anything, but he dropped $1 on the floor, and he didn't pick it up. He left it there, like a curse. I didn't touch it. The truth is, I began to dissolve. Not physically, but in the way people forget how to see someone. I became background, a blurred figure in the window of the laundromat, a pair of shoes walking past the pharmacy. My name wasn't spoken anymore, but I felt it in the air, like a splinter under skin. I knew they remembered, and I knew they wanted me to leave, but I stayed. Some mornings I walked to the edge of town, where the railroad tracks split the earth in two and the trees began to look wild again. I'd sit on a bench near the old station, now abandoned, and watch the wind play with the weeds. There, the town felt far away. The accusations, the stares, the history, all of it became thinner, like mist on the surface of a lake. I liked the sound of the wind through dry grass. It had no memory, no voice, just movement. Sometimes I thought about what forgiveness might look like, if it would come with words or gestures. But I knew better. Forgiveness wasn't for people like me. It wasn't an offering made in daylight. It wasn't a meal brought to your door or a chair pulled out at church. It was an absence, a quiet letting go. And that wasn't something this town knew how to do. So I made peace with being remembered badly. I began to write again, nothing grand, just lines in a notebook I kept beneath my mattress, descriptions of the sky, the way the light changed in October, the creaking sound the stairs made in the evening. I wrote to remind myself that I was still witnessing something, still alive in small ways. The world hadn't exiled me completely. I could still observe it, even if I wasn't allowed to be part of it. There was a boy who sometimes played with a toy truck in the parking lot below my window. He didn't know who I was, not yet. He waved once, just once. A bright, reckless wave like he thought I was someone worth smiling at. I didn't wave back. I couldn't. But I smiled. And for a moment, I wasn't the woman from the newspaper, or the rumor, or the court transcripts. I was just a face in a window, lit by the sun. That night, I slept without dreaming. The town didn't soften. It never does. It stays firm in its memory, like stone steps worn smooth by generations of boots. But I learned how to step lightly, how to breathe without asking for permission. I learned the names of the birds outside my window. I learned which parts of the day held less pain. I learned that silence can be a kind of mercy if you stop begging it for music. And slowly, without ceremony, the town and I reached an understanding. I would not ask it to love me, and it would not ask me to leave.